Hello and welcome to Tallahassee Tree Talks. I'm Daniel Siegel. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking to citizens of Tallahassee about knowledge, experiences, and stories that have to do with one of our city's most incredible characteristics. Trees play major roles in our lives, and we also play a major role in the lives of trees. Join me as I get to know more about people, trees, and their relationships in Tallahassee. This podcast is sponsored by a community engagement grant from the Sunshine State Biodiversity Group in Tallahassee, Florida, a nonprofit aimed at conservation, education, and community outreach on environmental issues facing the region. For more information, visit sunshinestatebiodiversitygroup.com. In this episode, we are going to be talking about tree art, virtual reality, mangrove salt extraction, a Moscow mule tree, St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, and an unusual kind of tea. When I interviewed Chase Clough, creator of the FSU Trees Instagram account, I mentioned the Rooting Branching Art Project. In April of 2023, the Florida State University Department of Art opened a public art project about sustainable campus infrastructure. The project was the result of collaboration between art department faculty Katie Kehoe and Keith Roberson, Andy Opel of the School of Communications, who helped make this podcast a reality, and two employees of the FSU Grounds Department, Phoenix Furman, greenhouse manager, and David McManus, assistant manager of grounds and landscaping, who I interviewed a few episodes ago. One component of the project was the planting of 3 native fruit and nut trees, Yaupon holly, black walnut, and Stewart pecan. The other major component was augmented reality student artwork, accessible via QR codes posted next to the newly planted trees. Art can be a powerful tool for connecting people with the natural environment around them. In Tallahassee, we're always surrounded by trees, and it can be easy to become accustomed to this. Art can help remind us to appreciate and notice trees. It can also connect both its audience and its creators to them in fascinating ways. Today, we're going to be hearing from one of the student artists who created work for the Rooting Branching Project.
So, hello, I'm Craig Moore III. I'm a artist and student here at Florida State University. I just wrapped up with my BFA this past spring, and I'm going to be starting my Master of Science in Information in the fall. I also work at the Innovation Hub, where right now I'm kind of on in a special forces type of role, but I mostly work in our Gail Rubini New Media Design Lab, where I kind of handle systems administration and work with a bunch of virtual reality development workstations. So I try to keep those computers running in tip-top shape for people. And aside from work, I like to work with photogrammetry, 3D scanning, and virtual environments in my art a lot. I primarily use Blender to kind of edit my assets, and I mostly scan on my phone.
Almost all of Craig's work uses digital media to explore components of natural environments. His art was perfectly suited for the Rooting Branching Project.
I participated in the Rooting Branching Project through one of Keith Roberson's animation classes. We were tasked with responding to trees in general as kind of a concept for this project, and it was my understanding that the artworks would be presented alongside these freshly planted tree saplings around campus. So to do this, I took inspiration from some science fiction texts and things like that, specifically the Strugatsky brothers' Roadside Picnic and the film adaptation by Andrei Tarkovsky, Stalker, and was thinking about this kind of, I hesitate to call it post-apocalyptic, but post-human landscape and things like that, and actually started the project in virtual reality in Google Tilt Brush, which is, for those who remember this pretty early VR painting software that Google released for free. It was the first one I had familiarity with, so this was also kind of my first time using a VR headset as an art making tool, and was semi-familiar with Tilt Brush. So hopped into Tilt Brush and began creating this kind of impossibly large tree type of form.
When creating this tree form, Craig began to realize the power virtual reality gave him over scale.
I'd imagine it almost kind of drawing a tree that looks like it could fit in the shape of your hands, and then in an instant be able to kind of stretch that out and make it really, really large and tower over you, really with no work on my part. There's literally just a single function to kind of size things up and down, and that was a very early gesture that was super interesting to me, and it quickly made me realize how scale could start to be incorporated in virtual reality or augmented reality kind of artwork. So started by making this tree kind of impossibly large, and then wrapped it in these kind of cloth-like forms, and started to kind of make it look like people, humans, had kind of left things behind on this tree and kind of interacted with it, and potentially kind of discarded those things near the tree, and ended up exporting that. And Keith then took my piece and a variety of other pieces by my peers and put them in an augmented reality software so that you would use your phone to scan a QR code at the base of these saplings, and it would populate the artwork seemingly in the space around you with the phone camera, and you'd be able to kind of pan around the space and look at the artwork to scale in the phone camera. So kind of took a pretty new approach to art making, and I don't typically draw or sculpt. That's not really my forte, but this kind of gave me an opportunity to draw and sculpt with my full body. VR is kind of interesting because as you use the handheld controllers, you can kind of move them above and below you, and you can walk around the piece as you create it. So I was very interested in the idea of the kind of post-human landscape and human imprints on nature at the time, and kind of explored those familiar themes with this brand new technology. And it was a lot of fun. There was kind of some challenges that were presented by it in terms of, for me at least, it kind of is obvious that the work was created in Tilt Brush, and a lot of Tilt Brush works kind of start to have the same look and feel and whatnot. But I was ultimately pretty happy with the way it came out. And then getting to see it kind of introduced into the environment on the day that we fully put the project together was very interesting as well.
Not all of the art in the Rooting Branching project took this sort of form. Each artist had a unique understanding of and relationship with the trees that were inspiring them. Trees have many defining characteristics, and there are countless ways to go about representing them.
I remember that there were a number of, I believe they were in a sculpture class, but they were doing a performance kind of module, if you will. They were focused on performance for this specific project. So a lot of students had these very interesting 3D videos that they took of them doing these different performances, and some of them kind of looked like dances, but I'll just kind of stick more broadly to performances with the body. And I remember there were these 3D videos that you could scan the QR code and look at in the same kind of augmented reality way. Being that they're 3D videos, you could tilt the phone to look around at the different pieces of the scene. And I believe the background was also kind of one of those volumetric photos of the sites that these QR codes were installed in. So you had this 3D photograph background of the area that you were viewing the work in. And then you had the figures, which were the students in this class that were doing the performance. And they were all kind of doing these responses to trees, I believe, and these different kind of performances with their body language, and students kind of taking these very still positions and almost becoming tree-like in that way, and creating this kind of lightly humorous but ultimately quite meditative performance of almost becoming one with or identifying with the tree and performing as a tree. I thought that was really interesting to have in conjunction with the 3D illustrated works and kind of 3D sculpted works that we were creating in the animation class. Some of my peers were kind of directly imbued in the piece with their likenesses, and some of my other peers, including myself, were indirectly imbued in the piece through our artwork.
Because of these differences from the art he was creating, the dance-like modules were particularly memorable for Craig.
That is what sticks out most primarily because it was the half of the project I saw exclusively on the day that was unveiled, whereas my animation peers and I were workshopping it kind of for weeks. So it was very exciting to see the way it all came together on the moment of. So that's kind of what sticks out to me the most in my memory, because it was kind of the big, or not the big, but the pleasant surprise of the project when we actually installed the work outside and all met that afternoon to tour the works and explore them and celebrate what we had done.
There was more to rooting branching than just art projects. As we learned from Chase Clough, trees can help people form connections to each other. This was certainly the case with rooting branching, especially on the day the project was finally unveiled.
We looked at 3 trees on Landis, and I believe they were fully grown variants, or not variants, but fully grown trees that of the same species that we were planting. And there was also little placards around each of those, and those were the ones where the dance pieces were featured. And we met under the shade of the large oak tree outside of Strozier, and had tea made from one of the trees. And I'm trying to remember precisely which tree the tea was made from, but we had this tea, and it was very dark, and it was quite bitter, and tasted a bit like prune juice, in my opinion. And me and many of my peers just kind of reveled in how strange it was, as our tongues were kind of going numb, tasting this strange, I believe it was Yaupon holly tea, I believe, and tasting this strange tea and kind of sitting under the shade in this muggy afternoon, and just kind of uniting and being excited about this kind of strange project we had all worked on. And for me, it felt like almost kind of in isolation, where we all worked on our individual components, and then we all kind of united for this exciting little party underneath this oak tree, where we're drinking this strange, dark, mysterious liquid and embracing the kind of excitement and strangeness of what we had done. So it was a really exciting and enjoyable night, and really sticks out as one of the more esoteric events of my time in the BFA at FSU. And
there was also a tour of all the different trees and pieces of artwork.
Again, like any kind of community engagement you do on campus, you're getting those looks, and you're getting curious onlookers to come by and ask what's going on. And I think it was a very kind of fun and productive way of just dedicating an evening to embracing art and trees at the same time, and just spending time together as a art community was great.
Before the artwork was installed, there was a planting ceremony for the sapling trees.
We all met in very kind of early, not early, but it was earlier in the morning, and it was very hot out, and we all met closer to the music building where the 3 saplings were planted, and we met with some higher ups with FSU groundkeeping, and they talked about each tree and what they represented to the local ecosystem and where they came from, and we kind of commemorated each tree as we planted them. And that was, again, just a really fun and unique and kind of lighthearted event, where a bunch of us from the art community who don't normally spend that much time outside of class in one place kind of met up and united around this common goal of planting trees and recognizing trees. And there was not too much more to the event than that, and that kind of beautiful simplicity was something that really struck me, and I reflect very fondly on that hot, sweaty morning digging holes with my art peers.
The tea Craig is describing is indeed Yaupon holly tea. I've made it before. It can be a fun experience to go out and pick your own leaves for tea. The plant is easy to recognize, and making the tea just requires roasting and drying the leaves, then grinding them up and brewing them. Yaupon holly is the only caffeinated plant native to North America. In many ways, it's similar to mate.
I do remember them saying that it has caffeine in it, but I couldn't really imagine drinking enough of it to get my caffeine fix, because, again, it made my tongue go completely numb.
The tea brewed from Yaupon leaves, sometimes called Cassina or the black drink, was drunk by almost all the indigenous groups who live within its range. The Appalachee, former inhabitants of Tallahassee, certainly consumed it. When the Spanish arrived in North Florida, they took to Yaupon tea as well, and it was sold and drunk in the United States and even Europe through the time of the American Revolution. Yaupon holly's scientific name is Ilex vomitoria. Somewhat of a misnomer, as the tea does not induce vomiting. It does have some relationship to purification rituals, though, and in some cultures may have been mixed with other herbs that produce an emetic effect. While Yaupon holly was once hugely popular for the indigenous communities who lived in its range, this relationship has diminished over time, as many tribes were wiped out or relocated to regions where Yaupon does not naturally occur. This is true for the Apalachee tribe. When I communicated with Councilman Gilmer Bennett of the Talamali Band of the Apalachee people, currently located in central Louisiana, he told me that the Apalachee people desire to return back to our homeland between the rivers. A sense of place is extremely important for many cultures and communities. Trees, as well as the rituals associated with them, such as the drinking of Yaupon tea, are an important aspect of this sense of place. Arguably, the most significant impact of the Rooting Branching Project was the connections it formed. Engaging with trees formed more profound relationships between Florida State University art students, but it also connected them to the natural ecosystems of North Florida. Those passers-by and onlookers Craig mentioned, as well as anyone who scans the QR codes and views the artwork on campus, were also connected to the trees, artists, and ecosystems. And is the QR code still up?
To my knowledge, it is. We were having some technical difficulties on the day, and I'm not sure if those have gotten resolved, so mileage may vary depending on the device that you bring out to the site. With all new media art, there's always glitches and hiccups and compatibility issues and things like that. So if you do find one of those QR codes, I would be very interested to know if they're still up and running and working.
Unfortunately, when I checked, the QR codes weren't operational. But, as Craig said, your mileage may vary. And I'm very curious about this sort of tree form that you created. What was it like sort of drawing inspiration from trees to create art?
Well, kind of as I had touched on earlier, it was very interesting to possess the power to immediately kind of see the scale increase. Kind of growing up in Florida, one of the biggest kind of impacts that trees have had on me are the kind of canopy, grandfather oak canopies and Spanish moss that hangs from them. And I kind of got very used to, as a child, trees being this very constant thing, because we don't really have seasonal change, especially I'm from Central Florida in Tampa. So we don't really experience seasonal change. The trees do not really change in their kind of lusciousness throughout the year, and they continue to be vibrant and green almost year round. So I think that's something I kind of internalized and almost took for granted as a kid, that year round you will have trees towering over you with leaves and moss kind of encompassing the area around you and making shade and everything. And I think that kind of inherent scale and always being able to look up and see trees was something that worked its way into the piece as I kind of stretched it out and made it almost impossibly large, to the point where it would have to be thousands of years old for it to actually be a tree in terms of the scale. As such, I was also kind of able to see the ways in which virtual trees would never kind of embrace the actual kind of majesty of trees that surround you in nature. Being that it's so effortless to kind of create that, it almost becomes arbitrary in that way.
Virtual trees, while they can form connections between people and their environments, cannot truly replace real ones. This is for several reasons, and one of them is technological. Yeah, and so what do you think is sort of the benefit of using technology to create art in this way and to access it too, what with people being able to scan it with their phones? That's
interesting. Something I'm interested in, and I don't know if this fully answers your question, is the idea of photography or other forms of kind of technological interpretation, if you will, as a means of, or kind of an allegory for memory and remembering things. So I like to think, especially when I'm scanning the trees and capturing them from angles and walking around them and trying to kind of encompass their form in a 3D scan or a photograph or a video or something like that, I'm kind of spending this time around the tree and kind of forming this intimate memory around it. And then when I come back into the studio and start to look at those materials that I've gathered, I see the scans that I've taken, and they're kind of ripped and distorted, and they're kind of filled with these impossible glitches and things like that. There is a decay that takes place in that process. I'm not perfectly representing one-to-one the kind of environments that I'm taking inspiration from. So I think one of the benefits is that it is, if you can even call it a benefit, is that it is a way that we can attempt to kind of translate the trees, or kind of interact with them, or even remember them. But then also getting to see those glitches and that decay and that distortion, for me, reinforces how amazing it is to actually be in the time and place around the trees themselves. And there's kind of a inherent tragedy to that effort.
Craig attempts to use his art to send the message that you can't fully remember something one-to-one. When you translate something into a new form, you're also going to morph and change it.
Getting back to the question of what's the benefit, I think it is one way that we can use these new tools and technologies kind of as an extension of our memories, and an extension of the events and places themselves, but ultimately points out the kind of frailty of technology in trying to pursue that kind of thing.
Craig hopes to send this message about memory to those who view his art.
The longer you kind of pull in and look at these, I'm specifically talking about scans and scanned objects, because it is kind of my favorite medium to work with right now. There is this kind of instant recognizability to the subject, and then as you start to investigate, you start to realize the polygons that are kind of forming the mesh of the object, if you will, the 3D body, and then the photographs that are kind of mapped onto those meshes are smeared and stretched. And whether or not people are creating this dialogue between photography and memory, or those kinds of things, I do still think that the kind of act of recognizing the form and then pulling in and looking and realizing how kind of incorrect and glitched out it is a journey that I'm hoping to take my audience on. And that is something that I'm constantly playing with and intrigued by, is almost the uncanny or supernatural feeling of something not being quite right.
Craig is from Tampa, about a 4-hour drive away. Not too far, but the transition is certainly noticeable. North Florida's ecosystems and forests can be quite unique.
The differences are more numerous than I would have expected. I believe I heard somewhere that North Florida has more tree diversity than almost anywhere else in the world, and that I truly believe. As you kind of drive up US 19 from the Tampa area up here, the vegetation gets noticeably denser as you drive. And because there's so much diversity here in Tallahassee, not all trees change, but a lot of them do. And you do start to notice seasonal variation. The leaves do begin to fall off of some of the trees. And even still, the vegetation remains kind of unparalleled in its density and thickness and diversity.
Craig especially likes the variety of environments supported in North Florida.
Something that I really love is the drive from kind of urban Tallahassee to the extending outer areas to the Gulf Coast. And as you watch this really bizarre transition from these kind of tall, I'm not exactly sure, but these tall kind of forests of trees that you'd expect in a more northern area, and then you start to transition into more kind of like swampland, and it gets wetter and wetter, but some of those trees don't necessarily fade away, so you get these very interesting in-betweens where it's not quite the swampy cypress forests that I'm accustomed to from where I come from, but you get where there's this hybrid where it's still a very dense, luscious forest that it grows very, very tall despite being kind of soppy at the bottom and everything. And again, driving from urban Tallahassee down to the Gulf Coast, you get to tour so many different kind of ecosystem compositions, and they're all so kind of their own and esoteric in their own way, and yet they all live amongst each other and kind of completely on top of each other.
It isn't just places where types of forests mix that make the Tallahassee area special. The stark borders between them can be just as striking.
Something that I've just noticed and been really excited by living in North Florida is the strange contrasts between different kinds of trees that you'll get that you don't really get anywhere else in the world, to my knowledge, because these compositions simply can't grow in many other climates. So moving to Tallahassee definitely renewed my appreciation for these kind of anomalous areas in our world's ecosystem where potentially lots of diversity can grow and maybe potentially lots of or a lack of diversity can grow. And it makes me excited to kind of find more interesting biological pockets that like Tallahassee, because really that's what it feels like to me, is kind of a pocket of this unparalleled diversity and verdancy that even makes me surprised at how luscious and vibrant and gigantic it can feel.
Although Craig's art relies on technology, it has brought him closer to natural environments in North Florida.
So with all of my art making, I work primarily when I'm kind of generating new assets and ideas. I'm almost always outside. I'm always almost always in the field, collecting photos or scans or videos in the environment of different things that catch my eye. I love getting really close up and filming insects and things like that. And as consumer cameras get better and better and better, and the fidelity just keeps increasing, and kind of optical and digital zoom becomes easier to achieve with just a basic smartphone, I've found that you can really kind of get up close and personal with a lot of kind of different textures and things in nature that I find really interesting. So
in the field, Craig gathers as much material as he can in many different formats.
I'm trying to kind of capture as much as possible, whether that's taking the time, the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to scan something and kind of walking around it and getting the looks from everybody as I kind of meticulously scan it, or just grabbing a quick 30-second Steadicam shot. And I'll kind of look at them as forms or as photographs and whatnot, and start to find things I like about them, things I don't, different little colors or subject matter or passages in the individual scans or videos that I want, and start to kind of clip them. And then depending on how much of an outcome I have planned, I'll start to kind of manipulate those into whether it's a 3D render that is supposed to be viewed kind of printed out and framed, or if it's something that is kind of designed to be explored in a virtual space, will kind of push in that will kind of inform the direction I take it in.
An example is one of Craig's projects from a show he had with Sarah Kate Evans and Andy Marlowe in April of 2024 in the local 621 Gallery, an exhibition space in Railroad Square.
I rendered a scan of some palm trees in a kind of a two-dimensional render and printed that out. And then I cut with a laser cutter alongside the border of the scan so that there's it's tightly following the geometry of the scan and all of these jagged edges and polygons that are formed. And then I mounted that laser cut paper on some MDF panel and cast the thing in resin so that it kind of formed this not quite flat cut out shape, and and hung it so that it's staggered off of the wall so that it casts a shadow, so that it's obvious that it's this kind of 2D, 3D form, in addition to the fact that it is a 2D render of a 3D scan. So multiple layers where I'm compressing 2D into 3D and then stretching 2D back out into 3D, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was kind of always designed to be viewed on a wall, kind of in a gallery or something like that. But the same assets, the same scans of those palm trees are also found in a virtual environment that I host on New Art City called The Outpost, which is something you can explore with a kind of disembodied camera that you control with a typical video game controller and investigate almost in the style of a video game or something like that.
There was a difference between Craig's digital use of this palm tree scan in New Art City and the physical use in 621 Gallery.
In the printed version, I was able to preserve all of the fidelity of the scan. You can really see each kind of image, flat image texture mapped onto this 3D form, and it's very high resolution. Whereas in the virtual space, to preserve memory, just kind of as a result of uploading these things into a virtual space, I actually needed to decimate the scan, reduce the polygon count, and kind of sand off a lot of the detail in those scans. So there's these two alternate versions of the same palm tree scan that was taken at the little pavilion when you're driving into St. Mark's. You can kind of view those trees in a few different ways, both through my art and they are real trees that are still up in North Florida. So for me, I think it's interesting that there's these, depending on the approach that I'm taking and the end goal that I'm taking, I can use a lot of these different assets that I'm gathering without any specific intention in mind when I'm capturing them in the field, but I can incorporate them and kind of bend and stretch them for different purposes. And I can highlight the detail and fidelity of the scan when I need to, but then I can also decimate it into something more abstract and unrecognizable when I need to, all from the same pool of assets that I'm generating out in the field, again, just without any specific purpose. So
Craig intentionally distorts the scans in his art. But if fidelity was your goal, how close could a digital tree get to a real one?
So that is completely up to the person doing the scanning. Something that very quickly intrigued me about photogrammetry when it was introduced to me by Trey Buscarin, art faculty member who has left FSU now. But when I was interning for him, he showed me photogrammetry and showed me the way you could purposefully kind of disrupt the scan by having the figure, say you're scanning a person. If you're scanning them from one angle and then you have the figure move as you're moving positions as well, the gyroscope in the phone believes that you should be seeing the image from a different perspective, so it's going to retake all of the new photographs. But if your figure has moved, it's going to rephotograph, moved with the cameraman. It's going to rephotograph a lot of the same image, if you will, on different geometry, because the phone knows that it's moved, it's in a different position in space. So what you can get is kind of a head that seemingly is just full of faces if you move with it. But on the flip side of that, if the person stands very, very still and you take your time and you really kind of slowly move through and are very methodical with how you scan, you can get a high level of detail. If the phone can really focus on the difference, it's ultimately kind of scanning for differences in depth and color and things like that. If it can scan the difference accurately, it will largely map the difference accurately. So it comes down to intention.
Craig's scans are intentionally distorted, but they don't have to be.
If I were to spend the time to really capture every surface in detail, you could create it'd be a huge file and there'd be not much you could do with it. It'd be hard to 3D print in a lot of cases, and it also wouldn't really work for a lot of virtual applications because of how much detail there would be. But if you spent the time to really work with it, you could get a pretty seamless, I'd say 1-to-1, even considering everything I said about how impossible it is to translate things. But you could get a close to 1-to-1 digital representation of something. So for my purposes, I'm primarily I almost call it like a dance that I form with the scanning, where I'm purposefully jumping around and moving too quickly for it to catch up and forcing it to kind of photograph the same elements of the object in from multiple positions and whatnot. That works for me because of the goal I'm trying to achieve, but really 3D scanning is a way to almost seamlessly kind of pull things into the virtual space.
There are many potential uses for high-quality scans.
It's a tactic used in museums, and I had a little bit of familiarity with 3D scanning from volunteering in the Digital Media Fab Lab in the Fine Arts Building, and I was actually scanning some old kind of broken pottery pieces from the Museum of Fine Arts archive, and then reconstructing those pottery pieces in a virtual space. And that had a very different end goal in mind, where I'm capturing millions and millions and millions of points and creating these extremely dense, they're called point clouds, the unprocessed scans, and creating these extremely dense point clouds that were kind of cumbersome to work with, all with the end goal of almost seamlessly representing this object. And that was how I started scanning, and from there started to kind of pull it back and realize the ways I could interject the artist, into that process, compared to just trying to kind of seamlessly represent. And that's where I formed my interest in photogrammetry, beyond it being a really useful tool.
Photogrammetry isn't too hard to get into. There are plenty of free apps you can use to make high-quality scans.
I also encourage people that if they are interested to mess with it, to purposefully disrupt it. Try scanning things near a mirror and watch how it creates the mirror space with just as much depth and fidelity as it does the real space, and see the kind of the things that it gets hung up on. I think is very interesting.
There's an interesting parallel between Craig Moore III's 3D scanning dance, the visual gestures he used to create his rooting branching piece, and the other dance-like performances featured in the Rooting Branching project. Although we often think of them as stationary, there is something about trees that inspires movement, and trees themselves can be surprisingly mobile. There's a reason we say they dance in the wind, and if you've ever seen a time-lapse of a plant growing, you can see that they're certainly not static. They just take things at a different pace. Art can help bridge the gap between people and trees. When we recognize that they are living, moving beings, we can begin to form a deeper connection to them. Craig Moore III's piece in Rooting Branching displays human interactions with trees. It features a tree that looks like it's covered by things discarded or left behind by people. Craig is fascinated by the relationship between people and trees and the forms that can result from it. And so you mentioned also your field work and gathering a lot of, specimens and artifacts and scans in the field. What are your favorite places in North Florida or in this area to go and, actually do that kind of work?
Well, off the top of my head, my favorite place to scan is honestly around campus, because as somebody who's pretty interested in the way that humans directly interact with trees, it is very interesting to find different well, let me put it this way. One of my favorite scans I've ever taken is something I call Moscow Mule Tree, because walking back from a basketball game one night, I saw near the football stadium, there was these, I want to say they're eucalyptus trees, and off of the branch of one of the eucalyptus trees, somebody had hung one of those brass Moscow Mule drinking cups, and for some reason, I found it very, very funny to just imagine like a Moscow Mule cup growing on a tree. So I scanned it, and it also had one of those red FSU kind of emergency light boxes that wasn't working and was completely taped up at the time. So that happened to be right next to this eucalyptus tree, if I'm not mistaken, that's what it was, with a Moscow Mule cup seemingly growing out of it. And it created the setting for one of my favorite scans that I haven't really figured out what to do with yet, because it's kind of just like almost a joke of a scan. But it was very interesting to be there and see this strange kind of surreal kind of situation, this object growing off of a tree seemingly, and to scan it and immortalize it forever. And of course, if you go back, FSU grounds have cleaned it up and it's not there anymore, but it feels too good to be true in terms of how strange and bizarre the situation was. And that I have a scan of it is just all the better for me, because I almost think no one would believe me if I told them I saw this, and it is still very interesting and weird to look at. And that is just kind of one example of what you can find wandering around a place like a college campus, where there's so much kind of verdancy everywhere with the beautiful groundskeeping. And then there's also tens of thousands of students just unleashed on it every day, and seeing the way that kind of takes its toll and interacts, and the way people use or potentially abuse the trees is interesting to me. So of the places in North Florida that have kind of given me the most surprise when I'm out in the field, scanning on a place like a college campus or around a college campus is very interesting, just because of how alive it is with both human activity and nature.
Interactions between people and trees can make for interesting art, but there are also places around Tallahassee where trees are left a bit less disturbed than on Florida State's campus. Craig has found these to be productive places to scan as well.
I will say the place I've probably done the most photogrammetry in general is out at the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge. I was working on a project for Keith's class. Much of the workflow I've developed and talked about here came from work I was doing with Keith Roberson and in his class. And there was a specific final project where I was out at St. Mark's several weekends a month, just scanning everything I could, scanning the lighthouse from the ground, and the lighthouse kind of just disappears into nothing as the phone can't kind of reach further and further, and scanning the kind of Florida weather station meter boxes and the pavilions, and just scanning all of these different things, and also scanning lots of the trees and flowers and fauna and things like that. It was very interesting, and I had kind of just finished reading Annihilation for the first time as well, so was thinking about a lot of the kind of impossibilities and kind of bizarre phenomena that book presents, and being able to go to the place that really inspired the location of that text was interesting way of engaging with that text as an artist, and kind of imagining this sci-fi reality in real time with photogrammetry, and letting photogrammetry kind of steer the visual language of that, and realizing how kind of close it resembled my understanding of this kind of bizarre phenomena depicted in the book. So St. Mark's is kind of bountiful and inspirational in many, many ways, and scanning there and collecting photos and videos there is really no different.
Annihilation is a science fiction text written by Tallahassee local Jeff Vandermeer, who is also one of the founders of the Sunshine State Biodiversity Group, the organization sponsoring this podcast. If you're interested in the strange ecosystems of North Florida, Annihilation and the other books in the Southern Reach series are certainly worth a read. So one of the questions I've been asking everyone that I've met with is, do you have a favorite type of tree? And then do you have a favorite specific individual tree somewhere in Tallahassee?
Sure. The easiest answer for my favorite type of tree would probably have to be mangroves, because they're so familiar to me. I remember going to, in Pasco County, we have a place called the EMC, and it is basically a marine research center that you get brought to on a elementary school or middle school field trip. But it's unlike a lot of other field trips, because you're doing things like wading out into the estuary with a net and seeing what kind of organisms come back in the net, and then releasing them and studying them. And one of the other things that really kind of stuck with me was the teacher explaining the water filtration role that mangroves have, and the kind of protection that they grant against natural weather or natural disasters and hurricanes and things like that. And to illustrate this point, she simply had us pluck a leaf off of the mangrove and taste the salt that was coming out of the leaves, because it's processing the salt water and turning it, I believe, into fresh water for the rest of the estuary, the freshwater needs of the estuary. And to realize at age 6 or 7 that you could taste salt water in the leaves of this tree that was filtering it, it made me realize that the organic ecosystem around me was incredibly complex. I was somebody who loved video games and technology for all of my life, so I was kind of accustomed to that type of complexity and those systems and whatnot. But to be outside in the heat and to realize that the complex technology beneath my feet in terms of the interconnected ecosystem of Florida, it blew my mind and gave me a very early appreciation for the ecosystem that I grew up in, and how complex and how necessary each individual component is. That mangroves, if mangroves were not suddenly removed from the equation, if mangroves were suddenly removed from the estuary, it would be disastrous, because this role that is so pivotal that I can literally taste the kind of results of it, if that was removed, I then kind of understood the gravity of each individual component in an ecosystem. And that was something that was super impactful to me early on, and still sticks with me. It's hard to not want to taste a mangrove leaf whenever I'm back down in the kind of Gulf Coastal Central Florida area.
Beyond mangroves, other childhood experiences with trees have stuck with Craig throughout the years as well.
As for a favorite specific tree, it's not in Tallahassee. It's back in the suburbs I grew up in outside of Tampa, but it was a kind of a planned new suburban development, kind of pseudo-urban suburbs kind of development. And with that, we had lots of our planned kind of suburban green spaces that ultimately felt kind of just like fields for the most part, or playgrounds and typical kind of urban green spaces that you'd think of. But one of them, I believe the park is called Oni Park, what we affectionately called the Big Tree as kids. There was a very large grandfather oak with one limb that grew very, very close to the ground, so that even if you were 4 or 5 years old and only 3 feet tall, you could climb up on it and begin to climb this grandfather oak. And over many, many summers, we felt like kind of explorers charting this tree. And my stepbrother would always get like 5-6 feet higher than me, and I could never get that high. And when you'd get to a new branch on the tree, it felt like you were unlocking something. And it really provided hours and hours and hours of entertainment for me and my friends growing up in that neighborhood. And it's still there, but they've kind of cut off and cleaned it up, and it looks a lot more neat and orderly, and it is, 10, 15 years older than it was. But I still reflect very, very fondly on that specific tree and climbing it and kind of learning I think from then just learning the scale and sturdiness of these trees, and on a very personal level, just realizing what a tree could provide you in terms of shade and fun and comfort, and a kind of a stage for you to argue with your siblings or meet new friends in the neighborhood and things like that. And it was just a kind of a centralized meeting place for us all to hang out. And in my head, the surrounding palm fronds were 10 feet tall, and it was filled with snakes, and we were, brave adventurers for being in the tree. But in reality, it is a planned urban green space in a suburb outside of Tampa. But I reflect incredibly fondly on the specific grandfather oak, so it's hard not to mention it.
Craig Moore III's connection to trees runs deep. Through his art, he's been able to maintain and even strengthen it, and quite possibly spread it to others. Trees have been the subjects of art for thousands and thousands of years. No matter how much the technology changes, this isn't going to stop anytime soon. The student art pieces displayed in the Rooting Branching project can be accessed at rooting-branching.create.fsu.edu. Check them out, they're really something special. Or, even better, visit the art in person alongside the sapling trees that inspired it. Thank you for tuning in to Tallahassee Tree Talks. Special thanks goes to my guest, Craig Moore III, and to Katie Kehoe and Keith Roberson, the Florida State Department of Art faculty who got me in contact with him and who made the Rooting Branching project possible.